I was sitting in my office at the district attorney's headquarters in downtown Phoenix, Arizona, reviewing a case file when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Something told me to answer it anyway, and the moment I did, my blood ran cold. A panicked school secretary was on the other end, telling me that someone had just attempted to take my 7-year-old daughter Emma from Saguaro Elementary School without authorization. My hands started shaking as I grabbed my keys and bolted out the door, leaving my assistant David standing there with his mouth open, holding papers that suddenly didn't matter at all. The drive to Emma's school normally took 15 minutes, but I made it in 8, my heart pounding the entire way. I'd been a prosecutor for 12 years and the district attorney for Maricopa County for the past 2, handling cases involving everything from fraud to violent crimes, but nothing had ever terrified me like this moment. Emma was my entire world, especially since my wife Sarah had passed away from cancer 3 years ago. It had just been the two of us, figuring out life together, and the thought of someone trying to take her made my vision blur with rage and fear. I pulled into the school parking lot with my tires screeching and ran toward the main entrance. Principal Anderson was waiting for me at the door, her face pale and worried. She immediately led me to the office where I found Emma sitting in a chair, clutching her backpack and looking confused but unharmed. I dropped to my knees and pulled her into my arms, holding her tight enough that she squeaked. "Daddy, you're squishing me," she said, but I could hear the tremor in her voice. She'd been scared too. "I'm sorry, sweetie. I'm just so glad you're okay." I pulled back to look at her face, checking for any signs that someone had hurt her. "Can you tell me what happened?" Emma's teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, was standing nearby with her arms crossed, looking furious. "Mr. Crawford, I can explain what we saw." A woman came to the front office about 40 minutes ago claiming she was authorized to pick up Emma. She had some kind of paperwork with her that she said was from you, giving her permission to take Emma out of school for a dental appointment. "I never authorized anything like that," I said, my prosecutor instincts kicking in even as my hands still shook. "Who was this woman?" Principal Anderson pulled out a clipboard. "She signed in as Patricia Hendricks. She's listed as the HOA president for your neighborhood Desert Springs Estates. The secretary, unfortunately, didn't verify with you first because the woman was very insistent and the paperwork looked official. But Mrs. Rodriguez happened to be walking past and recognized that something was off." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded firmly. "I know all my students' pickup arrangements, and I'd never heard of this Patricia person." When I questioned her, she became extremely aggressive and demanded that Emma be brought to the office immediately. That's when I told Principal Anderson we needed to verify with you first. The woman became irate, started yelling about HOA regulations and authority, and actually tried to walk back toward the classrooms herself to find Emma. We had to physically block her path and threaten to call the police before she finally left. My mind was reeling. Patricia Hendricks. I knew exactly who she was. The woman had made my life a living nightmare ever since I'd moved into Desert Springs Estates 18 months ago. She was the stereotypical HOA tyrant, a woman in her late 40s with an angular face, short blonde hair cut in what Sarah would have called a speak-to-the-manager style, and an attitude that suggested she believed she was the supreme ruler of our neighborhood. She'd sent me violations for everything from my grass being a 1/4 inch too tall to Emma's pink bicycle being visible from the street, claiming it violated some obscure aesthetic clause in the HOA bylaws. But this was a completely different level of insanity. This was attempted kidnapping. "Did you call the police?" I asked, standing up while keeping one hand on Emma's shoulder. Principal Anderson nodded. "Yes, right after she left. They should be here any minute. We also have her on our security cameras. She was in the building for about 10 minutes total." As if on cue, 2 Phoenix Police Department officers walked through the door. I recognized one of them, Officer Martinez, from a case we'd worked together last year. His eyes widened when he saw me. "District Attorney Crawford, I didn't realize this involved your daughter." He immediately pulled out his notebook, his demeanor shifting to complete professionalism. "Tell me everything." I walked him through what I'd learned, my legal training helping me present the facts clearly despite the anger simmering under my skin. Officer Martinez took detailed notes while his partner, Officer Chen, went with Principal Anderson to review the security footage and get copies. "Mr. Crawford, this is clearly attempted kidnapping under Arizona Revised Statutes, Section 13-1304, Officer Martinez said. And I appreciated that he didn't talk down to me even though I probably knew the statute better than he did. The fact that she used fraudulent documents makes it even worse. We'll need to bring her in for questioning immediately." "I want to press full charges," I said firmly. "This isn't just some HOA dispute that got out of hand. She tried to take my child." Emma tugged on my sleeve. "Daddy, I don't understand. Why did that mean lady want to take me?" "Is this because of the basketball hoop?" My heart sank. Of course Emma would make that connection. "Just last week, I'd installed a basketball hoop on our driveway, and within hours, Patricia had appeared at my door with a violation notice, claiming that recreational equipment wasn't permitted to be visible from the street. I'd told her, perhaps less politely than I should have, that I'd reviewed the actual CC and Artiques, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions that governed our neighborhood, and there was no such rule. She turned purple with rage and stormed off, shouting something about how I'd regret defying her authority. "No, honey, this isn't your fault or about the basketball hoop," I said, kneeling down again. "Some adults make very bad choices and that's on them, not on you. You didn't do anything wrong." Officer Chen returned with a USB drive containing the security footage. "We've got clear images of her face and the fraudulent documents she presented." She also left her actual driver's license with the front desk as part of the sign-in process, so we have positive identification. I almost laughed at the absurdity. Patricia had tried to kidnap my daughter and had literally left her ID at the scene. The arrogance was stunning. "We're going to head to her address now," Officer Martinez said. "Given your position, I want to make sure we handle this completely by the book. I assume you'll want to recuse yourself from personally prosecuting this case." "Absolutely," I confirmed. "I'll have one of my senior ADA handle it, but I'll be providing a full witness statement and cooperating completely with the investigation." After giving my official statement to the officers, I signed Emma out of school for the rest of the day. She was quiet in the car, processing everything that had happened. I took her to her favorite ice cream place, trying to help her feel safe and normal again, even though my own mind was racing with worst-case scenarios about what could have happened if Mrs. Rodriguez hadn't been paying attention. "Daddy, what's going to happen to that lady?" Emma asked around a mouthful of chocolate chip cookie dough ice cream. I chose my words carefully. "She's going to have to answer for what she did. The police will investigate, and then lawyers and a judge will decide what the consequences should be. But the important thing is that you're safe, and we're going to make sure nothing like this ever happens again." "Is she going to jail?" "That's up to the judge and jury if it goes to trial." "But yes, she might go to jail. What she tried to do was very serious." Emma was quiet for a moment, then said something that broke my heart. "I miss Mommy." She would have known what to say to make this not scary. I reached across the table and took her small hand in mine. "I miss her too, sweetheart, every single day. But we're going to be okay, you and me. We're a team, remember?" She nodded, and we finished our ice cream in comfortable silence. When we got home to our house on Desert Springs Drive, I noticed several of my neighbors outside, clustered in small groups and talking in low voices. Word had apparently spread fast. My next-door neighbor, Jim Kowalski, a retired firefighter in his 60s, walked over as I was helping Emma out of the car. "Michael, I heard what happened," he said, his weathered face creased with concern. "Is Emma all right?" "She's fine, thank God, just shaken up." Jim shook his head in disgust. "That woman has been a menace since the day she became HOA president 3 years ago. But this is beyond anything I could have imagined. Half the neighborhood is ready to riot. We've been putting up with her tyranny for years, but trying to take someone's kid, that's unforgivable. The police are handling it," I assured him, "but I appreciate the support." "Anything you need, you just ask. I mean that." Jim glanced at Emma and softened his voice. "Hey there, Emma. How about you come over this weekend and help Mrs. Kowalski and me bake cookies?" She bought special decorating supplies. Emma managed a small smile. "Okay, Mr. Jim." I got Emma settled inside with her favorite movie and then allowed myself to check my work phone. I had 17 missed calls and twice as many emails. My assistant David had sent me an urgent message saying that the press had somehow already gotten wind of the story and were calling the office for comment. I sighed deeply. This was going to become a media circus, and the last thing I wanted was for Emma to be caught in the middle of it. I called my assistant district attorney, Rachel Morgan, one of the most competent prosecutors on my team. She answered on the first ring. "Michael, I heard, how's Emma?" "She's okay, all things considered. Rachel, I need you to take point on this case. I'm obviously conflicted out, but I trust you to handle it properly." "Consider it done." The police just brought Patricia Hendricks in for questioning about 20 minutes ago. She's with her lawyer now, some guy named Bernard Fletcher, who apparently specializes in real estate and HOA law. From what I'm hearing through the grapevine, she's claiming this was all a misunderstanding, that she was trying to help you out. I barked out a harsh laugh. "Help me out?" "By forging documents and trying to remove my child from school without my knowledge or consent." I'd love to hear her explain that logic. Her attorney is saying something about an HOA emergency that required Emma to be removed from school for safety reasons. It's complete nonsense, obviously, but that's their opening position. "Michael, this woman is delusional. The interview is being recorded and she's digging herself deeper with every word. She keeps talking about her authority as HOA president like it gives her some kind of jurisdiction over residents' children. Make sure everything is documented perfectly. I don't want any procedural issues that could get this thrown out. You know I will. I've already reached out to the school for all their records and security footage. We're building an airtight case. She's being charged with attempted kidnapping, forgery, and fraud. Given the severity, bail is going to be substantial." After I hung up with Rachel, I spent the next hour fielding calls from concerned friends and colleagues. My mentor, former district attorney Harold Webb, who'd retired 2 years ago and recommended me for his position, called to check on Emma and offer his support. Several judges I worked with regularly reached out with messages of concern. The legal community in Phoenix was tight-knit, and news traveled fast. That evening, after I'd put Emma to bed with extra hugs and reassurances, I sat down at my kitchen table with a glass of bourbon and tried to process everything. My phone buzzed with a text from Jim next door. "Turn on Channel 5 News, they're covering the story." I grabbed the remote and flipped to the local news station. Sure enough, there was a reporter standing outside Sagaro Elementary School with a breaking news banner that read, "HOA President Arrested for Attempted Kidnapping of District Attorney's Daughter." The reporter, a young woman named Jessica Torres, who I'd seen cover several of my cases before, was in the middle of her segment. "Tonight, we're learning new details about a shocking incident that unfolded earlier today at this Phoenix elementary school. Patricia Hendricks, age 48, who serves as the Homeowners Association president for the Desert Springs Estates neighborhood, has been arrested and charged with attempted kidnapping, forgery, and fraud after allegedly attempting to remove 7-year-old Emma Crawford from school without authorization. Emma is the daughter of Maricopa County District Attorney Michael Crawford. According to police sources, Hendricks presented fraudulent documents claiming she had permission to pick up the child for a dental appointment. School staff became suspicious and verified with Mr. Crawford, who knew nothing about the attempted pickup. Hendricks was taken into custody this afternoon and is currently being held at the 4th Avenue Jail. Her attorney issued a statement claiming this was a misunderstanding related to HOA business, but prosecutors are moving forward with serious charges. We'll continue to follow this developing story. The segment cut to a recorded statement from Rachel, who looked perfectly composed and professional. This was not a misunderstanding or an HOA matter. This was an attempted kidnapping of a child using forged documents. We take crimes against children extremely seriously in Maricopa County, and this case will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. My phone immediately started buzzing with texts from neighbors. Most were supportive, expressing shock and outrage at Patricia's actions, but a few were concerning. I got a message from a neighbor I barely knew, Todd something, who lived 3 streets over. Maybe if you hadn't been so defiant about HOA rules, Patricia wouldn't have felt forced to take such extreme measures. Some of us are tired of people moving into this neighborhood and thinking the rules don't apply to them. I stared at the message in disbelief. Was this person actually trying to justify attempted kidnapping as a reasonable response to an HOA dispute? I didn't respond. There was nothing productive I could say to someone with such twisted logic. The next morning, I took Emma to school personally and had a long meeting with Principal Anderson about enhanced security measures. The school agreed to implement a strict photo ID verification policy for all pickups and to require a phone call confirmation from parents for any unexpected changes to pickup arrangements. I also provided them with a list of people who were authorized to pick up Emma, which consisted of exactly 3 names: myself, my sister Lauren, who lived in Scottsdale, and the Kowalskis next door in case of emergency. When I arrived at my office, I found it surrounded by news vans. I made a brief statement reiterating that the case was being handled appropriately and that I had full confidence in my team, then declined to answer specific questions about the investigation. Inside, Rachel was waiting for me with updates. Patricia Hendricks was arraigned this morning. Bail was set at $250,000. Her attorney argued for lower bail, claiming she was a pillar of the community with no prior criminal record and no flight risk. The judge wasn't sympathetic, especially after reviewing the security footage and the fraudulent documents. She's still in custody because she hasn't been able to post bail yet. What about the HOA board? Has anyone from Desert Springs Estates made any statements? Rachel pulled out her tablet and showed me a news article from that morning. The vice president of the HOA board, a woman named Carol Martinez, issued a statement saying the board was shocked and appalled by Patricia's actions, and that they were convening an emergency meeting to discuss her removal from the presidency. Apparently, this isn't the first time Patricia has gone too far. Carol told a reporter that there have been complaints about Patricia's aggressive behavior for years, but the board kept hoping she'd moderate her approach. Too little, too late, I muttered. What else do we have? Forensics examined the documents Patricia presented to the school. They were crude forgeries, printed on regular computer paper with a fake signature that doesn't match your actual signature on file. She didn't even try to make them look professional. It's like she genuinely believed that her position as HOA president gave her the authority to do whatever she wanted. Over the next few days, More details emerged about Patricia Hendricks and her reign of terror over Desert Springs estates. Rachel's team interviewed dozens of neighbors, and the stories were all remarkably similar. Patricia had been issuing violation notices for the most ridiculous infractions imaginable. One family got a violation because their daughter left a pink chalk drawing on their driveway. Another was fined because their Christmas lights were the wrong shade of white. A retired couple was threatened with legal action because their garden gnome was 3 inches taller than the HOA bylaws supposedly allowed, even though no such rule actually existed in the written CC and Articles. What became clear was that Patricia had been making up rules as she went along, interpreting the vague language in the CC and Articles in the most restrictive way possible, and then enforcing her interpretations with an iron fist. Families who challenged her would find themselves targeted with increasingly petty violations, until they either gave in or moved away. Several former residents were tracked down and interviewed, all with similar stories of harassment that had driven them to sell their homes. But the most disturbing discovery came when Rachel's investigators dug deeper into Patricia's background. She had been the HOA president at her previous neighborhood in Chandler, a suburb of Phoenix, before moving to Desert Springs Estates. They contacted that HOA board and learned that Patricia had been forced to resign after multiple complaints about her aggressive behavior and misuse of HOA funds. She'd apparently spent thousands of dollars from the HOA reserves on personal legal fees related to her vendetta against a homeowner who'd painted their house the wrong shade of beige. She has a pattern of escalating behavior, Rachel told me during one of our case review meetings. Each time she's gotten away with something, she's pushed further. The attempted kidnapping of Emma was just the logical endpoint of years of believing she was above the rules and had absolute authority over everyone in her domain. "What's the defense strategy looking like?" I asked. Fletcher is trying to argue diminished capacity due to stress. He's had Patricia examined by a psychiatrist who's going to testify that she was suffering from an acute episode of delusional thinking brought on by the pressures of managing the HOA. It's a weak defense, but it's all they've got. The evidence against her is overwhelming. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks after the incident. I took the day off work and sat in the gallery with my sister Lauren, who'd driven in from Scottsdale to support me. Emma was safe at school, and I'd arranged for extra security just to be cautious, though Patricia was still in jail, unable to make bail. Patricia looked diminished when they brought her into the courtroom. Her signature blonde bob was disheveled, and she was wearing an orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on her frame. She'd apparently lost weight during her time in custody. But when her eyes scanned the gallery and landed on me, I saw a flash of the same arrogance and rage that had fueled her attempt to take my daughter. She leaned over and whispered something to her attorney, who shook his head firmly and put a hand on her arm, clearly trying to keep her under control. The hearing itself was procedural but important. Rachel presented the evidence methodically. The security footage showing Patricia entering the school and presenting the forged documents, testimony from school staff about her aggressive behavior when questioned, the documents themselves with their crude forgeries, and my own testimony about never having authorized anyone to pick up my daughter. The defense tried to poke holes in the timeline and suggest that there had been some miscommunication, but it was futile. The evidence was damning. Judge Catherine Morrison, a no-nonsense jurist in her late 50s who I'd appeared before many times, reviewed everything carefully and then ruled that there was more than sufficient probable cause to bind Patricia over for trial on all charges. She also denied a defense motion to reduce bail. Miss Hendricks, the evidence presented today suggests you engaged in a calculated attempt to remove a child from school using fraudulent documents, Judge Morrison said sternly. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a misunderstanding. You created false paperwork, presented yourself at the school with a planned story, and became aggressive when questioned. The fact that you're an HOA president doesn't grant you any special authority over your neighbor's children. Bail will remain at $250,000. Patricia started to stand up, clearly wanting to speak, but her attorney pulled her back down and whispered urgently in her ear. She sat back down but was visibly fuming. As I left the courthouse with Lauren, we were immediately swarmed by reporters. I made a brief statement thanking the school staff for their vigilance and the police for their swift action, then declined further comment. But one reporter's question cut through the noise and made me pause. "Mr. Crawford, some HOA board members from Desert Springs Estates are claiming that you antagonized Miss Hendricks by repeatedly violating community rules. Do you bear any responsibility for escalating this situation?" I turned to face the reporter, a middle-aged man from one of the local newspapers, whose name I couldn't remember. My sister put a hand on my arm, warning me not to engage, but I needed to address this. "Let me be absolutely clear," I said, my voice measured but firm. "There is no HOA violation, real or imagined, that justifies attempting to kidnap someone's child. None. The suggestion that I somehow bear responsibility for Miss Hendricks's criminal actions is not only insulting but dangerous. It implies that tyrannical behavior and escalating harassment are acceptable responses to disagreements about neighborhood aesthetics. They're not. What happened wasn't about a basketball hoop or the height of my grass. It was about a person who believed she had absolute power over her neighbors and was willing to cross criminal lines to assert that power. I hope this case serves as a wake-up call to HOAs across the country about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of accountability." The clip went viral. By that evening, it had been picked up by national news outlets and was trending on social media. I started receiving messages from people across the country who'd had their own nightmarish experiences with tyrannical HOA boards. The case had apparently struck a nerve with millions of Americans who felt powerless against aggressive homeowners associations. The media attention had an unexpected benefit. The Arizona State Legislature took notice, and 2 representatives from my district reached out to discuss potential reforms to HOA regulations in the state. They wanted to introduce legislation that would create more oversight for HOA boards, establish clearer limits on their authority, and implement mandatory training programs for board members about the legal and ethical boundaries of their positions. Meanwhile, the Desert Springs Estates HOA board finally took action. Patricia was formally removed as president in a unanimous vote, and Carol Martinez was appointed as interim president. Carol reached out to me personally to apologize on behalf of the board and to assure me that they were implementing significant reforms to how the HOA operated. They were reviewing all the violation notices Patricia had issued over the past 3 years, canceling fines that were based on made-up rules, and implementing a formal appeals process for homeowners who felt they'd been unfairly targeted. "We should have acted sooner," Carol told me when we met for coffee at a shop near the neighborhood. "We kept telling ourselves that Patricia was just passionate about maintaining property values, that she meant well even if her methods were heavy-handed. But we were enabling her, and I'm ashamed of that. What she did to you and Emma was unconscionable, but it was the endpoint of a pattern we should have stopped years ago." I appreciated Carol's honesty, even if it couldn't undo the trauma Emma had experienced. My daughter was doing better, but she'd started having nightmares about strangers trying to take her away. I'd gotten her into therapy with a child psychologist who specialized in trauma, and slowly she was processing what had happened. But the innocence she'd had before that day was gone, replaced with a wariness that broke my heart. The trial was scheduled for early September, about 4 months after the incident. Patricia had finally made bail after her family mortgaged their house to come up with the money. But she was under strict conditions, including GPS monitoring and a prohibition on coming within 500 feet of me, Emma, or Seguero Elementary School. She'd also been issued a restraining order at my request. In the weeks leading up to the trial, Rachel's team continued building their case. They'd identified the computer and printer Patricia had used to create the forged documents, both of which were in her home office. Digital forensics showed that she'd drafted multiple versions of the authorization letter over several days, refining the language to make it sound more official. This was critical evidence because it demonstrated premeditation rather than a spontaneous bad decision. They also uncovered Patricia's internet search history from the days before the incident. She'd been researching Arizona custody laws, school pickup policies, and even criminal penalties for parental interference. She'd clearly known what she was doing was illegal but had decided to do it anyway, apparently convinced she could get away with it because of her position as HOA president. The defense team had been busy too. They'd lined up their psychiatrist who would testify about Patricia's supposed mental health issues, as well as several character witnesses from Patricia's church and social circles who would describe her as a caring community member. They were also planning to call several Desert Springs Estates residents who would testify that I had been defiant and hostile toward HOA rules, trying to paint a picture of me as the real problem. Rachel and I met regularly to discuss strategy, even though I was officially recused from the case. She kept me informed as a courtesy and because my testimony would be crucial during the trial. "They're going to try to make this about you," Rachel warned me during one of our meetings. "Fletcher is going to paint you as an arrogant district attorney who thought he was above the HOA rules, who dismissed Patricia's legitimate authority, and who provoked her into increasingly desperate actions. It's a terrible strategy because it still doesn't justify attempted kidnapping, but he's hoping to create enough sympathy for Patricia that a jury might go easier on her." "Let him try," I said. "The facts are the facts. She forged documents and tried to take my daughter from school. No amount of character assassination against me changes that." The trial began on a sweltering Monday morning in September. The courthouse was packed with media, curious onlookers, and residents from Desert Springs Estates on both sides of the issue. Most of my neighbors were supportive, but there was a small contingent who apparently still believed Patricia had been in the right, or at least that she'd been justified in her concerns about my defiance of HOA rules. Jury selection took 2 days. Rachel was methodical about eliminating anyone who had extreme views about HOAs in either direction. She wanted jurors who could evaluate the evidence objectively without bringing their own HOA grievances into the deliberation room. The final jury consisted of 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from late 20s to early 70s, with a mix of homeowners, renters, and people who lived in non-HOA communities. Opening statements began on Wednesday morning. Rachel was crisp and professional, laying out the timeline of events and the evidence that would prove Patricia's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. She emphasized the premeditation aspect, the forged documents, and the potential danger Emma had been in. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about a woman who believed she had absolute authority over her neighbors and was willing to commit serious crimes to assert that authority," Rachel said, making eye contact with each juror. The defendant didn't just try to take Emma Crawford from school on a whim. She planned it over several days. She researched the laws she was breaking. She created fraudulent documents. She showed up at the school with a detailed story. And when questioned by school staff, she became aggressive and demanding, insisting they comply with her authority as an HOA president. The evidence will show that the defendant committed attempted kidnapping, a serious felony, and that she did so deliberately and with full knowledge that her actions were illegal. Fletcher's opening statement tried to reframe the narrative entirely. He painted Patricia as a dedicated community servant who'd been pushed to her breaking point by a defiant resident who refused to follow basic neighborhood rules. According to Fletcher, Patricia had become concerned about Emma's welfare after observing that I was frequently working late and leaving Emma alone at home, a complete fabrication. She decided to remove Emma from school to take her to her own home where she could be properly cared for, and the documents were just a misguided attempt to make the pickup seem official. It was a nonsense story that contradicted the evidence, but Fletcher delivered it with conviction. I sat in the gallery, seething at the implication that I was somehow neglecting my daughter, but I kept my expression neutral. Getting visibly angry would only play into their strategy. The prosecution's case took 3 days. Rachel called the school secretary who'd initially interacted with Patricia, Principal Anderson, Mrs. Rodriguez, and several other school staff members. She presented the security footage, which showed Patricia's demeanor shifting from friendly to aggressive when questioned. She called the forensics expert who'd examined the forged documents. She called the digital forensics expert who testified about Patricia's computer searches and the drafts of the authorization letter found on her hard drive. Then, it was my turn to testify. I'd testified in court hundreds of times as a prosecutor, but never as a victim and witness in my own case. It felt surreal to be sworn in and sit in the witness box, looking out at the packed courtroom with Patricia glaring at me from the defense table. Rachel took me through the events of that day, establishing that I'd never authorized anyone to pick up Emma, that I'd never had any concerns about Emma's care that would have prompted intervention from a third party, and that I'd been terrified when I received the call from the school. Then she asked me about my interactions with Patricia leading up to the incident. "Can you describe your relationship with the defendant prior to this incident?" Rachel asked. "It was contentious," I said honestly. Miss Hendricks began sending me HOA violation notices almost immediately after I moved into the neighborhood 18 months ago. The violations were often for extremely minor issues, or for things that weren't actually violations of the written CC and article. When I would challenge these notices and point out that the supposed rules she was citing didn't exist in the governing documents, she would become angry and issue additional violations. "Can you give the jury some specific examples?" She sent me a violation notice because my grass was allegedly too tall, even though it was well within the height specified in the CC and article. She sent me a notice because my daughter's bicycle was visible from the street, claiming there was a rule against recreational equipment being visible, which didn't exist in the actual documents. She sent me a notice because I planted flowers in my front yard that she claimed were the wrong color scheme for the neighborhood, again citing a rule that didn't exist. The most recent dispute was about a basketball hoop I'd installed on my driveway for my daughter. "How did the defendant respond when you challenged these violation notices?" She became increasingly angry and hostile. During our last interaction, about a week before the incident at the school, she came to my house to deliver a violation notice about the basketball hoop in person. When I told her I'd reviewed the CC and article, and there was no prohibition on basketball hoops, she became enraged. She told me that I would regret defying her authority, and that she would make sure I learned my place in this neighborhood. Fletcher objected, claiming I was characterizing Patricia's statements unfairly, but Judge Morrison overruled him. The witness may testify to his recollection of the conversation. "Did you take the defendant's threat seriously at the time?" Rachel asked. "Not really," I admitted. "I thought she was just blowing off steam." "I'd dealt with enough people making empty threats in my work that I didn't think she would actually follow through with anything. I certainly never imagined she would try to take my daughter from school. Fletcher's cross-examination was aggressive. He tried to paint me as arrogant and dismissive of community standards, suggesting that my legal training made me think I was above the rules that governed everyone else. He asked whether I'd considered how my defiance of HOA notices might affect my neighbor's property values. He questioned whether I'd been working excessive hours and leaving Emma inadequately supervised. I remained calm and factual in my responses, not taking the bait. I followed the actual written rules of the HOA as stated in the CC and Articus. When Miss Hendricks tried to enforce rules that didn't exist in writing, I pointed that out. That's not defiance. That's holding the HOA accountable to its own governing documents. As for my daughter, she's never been inadequately supervised. I have a rigorous schedule, but I also have reliable childcare and a strong support network. The suggestion that she was in any danger that required intervention from an HOA president is absurd and offensive. Fletcher tried several more times to rattle me, but I'd been cross-examined by better attorneys than him. After about 45 minutes, he gave up, and I was excused from the witness stand. The defense case began the following Monday. Fletcher called his psychiatrist first, a Dr. Robert Chambers who specialized in forensic psychology. Dr. Chambers testified that he'd evaluated Patricia and diagnosed her with adjustment disorder with anxiety, claiming that the stress of managing the HOA and dealing with difficult residents had caused her to experience an episode of impaired judgment. Rachel's cross-examination dismantled this testimony methodically. She got Dr. Chambers to admit that adjustment disorder didn't typically cause people to engage in premeditated criminal behavior. She pointed out that Patricia's computer searches proved she knew what she was doing was illegal, which contradicted the idea of impaired judgment. She asked whether Dr. Chambers had reviewed Patricia's history of similar aggressive behavior at her previous HOA, which he hadn't, and suggested that this wasn't an isolated incident caused by temporary stress, but rather a pattern of escalating tyrannical behavior. Fletcher then called several character witnesses who testified about Patricia's volunteer work and community involvement. They painted a picture of a dedicated neighbor who organized block parties, coordinated neighborhood watch programs, and genuinely cared about maintaining a pleasant community. None of them could explain away the attempted kidnapping, but they were meant to humanize Patricia for the jury. Then Fletcher made a strategic error. He called 3 Desert Springs Estates residents, who he thought would testify favorably about Patricia's concerns regarding my behavior. The first was Todd Brennan, the neighbor who'd sent me that appalling text message suggesting I shared blame for the situation. Todd testified that he'd observed me coming home late at night on multiple occasions and had seen Emma playing outside unsupervised, suggesting that Patricia's concerns about Emma's welfare were legitimate. Rachel's cross-examination destroyed his credibility within minutes. Mr. Brennan, you testified that you saw Emma Crawford playing outside unsupervised. What time of day was this? It was late afternoon, around 5 or 6 o'clock. And where were you when you made these observations? In my front yard doing some gardening. So you could see Emma playing outside, but you couldn't see whether Mr. Crawford or another adult was supervising her from inside the house or from a different vantage point. Todd hesitated. Well, no, I guess not. And you testified that you saw Mr. Crawford coming home late at night. What time specifically? It varied, but sometimes as late as 9 or 10 o'clock. Are you aware that Mr. Crawford is the district attorney for Maricopa County, and that his job often requires him to work irregular hours? I suppose so. Did you ever observe Emma at home alone during these late nights? No, but she might have been. So you're speculating, not testifying to actual observed facts. I just think Patricia had legitimate concerns. Mr. Brennan, did you send Mr. Crawford a text message on the evening after Miss Hendricks was arrested? Rachel pulled out a printed copy of the text message. A message that read, and I quote, "Maybe if you hadn't been so defiant about HOA rules, Patricia wouldn't have felt forced to take such extreme measures." Todd's face flushed red. I was just trying to point out that there were two sides to the story. So you believe that attempted kidnapping is a reasonable response to HOA disputes? I didn't say that. But you suggested Mr. Crawford shared responsibility for Miss Hendricks's decision to try to take his daughter from school. I just meant that the situation was complicated. Mr. Brennan, is it complicated to understand that you don't try to kidnap someone's child, regardless of disagreements about basketball hoops or grass height? Fletcher objected, but the damage was done. Todd left the witness stand looking foolish, and the other two defense witnesses Fletcher had planned to call were quietly excused without testifying. Their testimony would have been more of the same, and Fletcher wisely decided not to give Rachel any more opportunities to highlight the absurdity of trying to justify Patricia's actions. The final defense witness was Patricia herself. Fletcher had clearly debated long and hard about whether to put her on the stand, and ultimately decided he had to because without her testimony, there was no real defense. Patricia needed to try to explain her actions directly to the jury. She took the stand wearing a conservative navy suit and with her hair neatly styled. She'd clearly been coached extensively on her demeanor. Fletcher led her through a sympathetic narrative about her dedication to the neighborhood, her stress levels from managing difficult residents, and her growing concern about Emma's welfare. "I'd seen Emma outside alone on multiple occasions," Patricia testified, her voice quavering slightly. "I'd seen Mr. Crawford leaving early in the morning and coming home very late at night. I started to worry that this little girl wasn't being properly cared for. Then I heard from other neighbors who shared similar concerns. I felt like I had a responsibility as a community leader to do something." "What made you decide to go to the school that day?" Fletcher asked. "I'd been thinking about it for weeks. I thought if I could just talk to Emma, make sure she was okay, maybe offer to help Mr. Crawford with childcare, it might resolve my concerns. I know now that I went about it the wrong way, but at the time, I genuinely believed I was doing the right thing. I thought that as HOA president, I had a responsibility to look out for the welfare of everyone in our community, including the children." It was a carefully crafted response, but it fell apart under Rachel's cross-examination. "Miss Hendricks, you testified that you were concerned about Emma Crawford's welfare. Did you ever call Child Protective Services to report your concerns?" Patricia hesitated. "No, I didn't think it was quite that serious." "But you thought it was serious enough to forge documents and try to remove her from school without her father's knowledge." "I wasn't trying to remove her permanently. I just wanted to talk to her." "If you just wanted to talk to Emma, why did you tell the school secretary that you were taking her to a dental appointment?" "I thought they wouldn't let me see her otherwise." "So you lied to school staff about your intentions?" "It wasn't exactly a lie, more of a necessary simplification." Rachel pulled out copies of the forged documents. "Miss Hendricks, you created these documents that purported to be signed by Mr. Crawford, giving you authorization to pick up his daughter. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And you knew when you created them that Mr. Crawford had never given you such authorization?" "Yes, but I thought once he understood my concerns, he would agree that I'd done the right thing." "Did it occur to you to simply speak with Mr. Crawford directly about your concerns before attempting to take his daughter?" "We'd had so many contentious interactions that I didn't think he would listen to me." "So, instead of trying to have a conversation or contacting the appropriate authorities like Child Protective Services, you decided to forge legal documents and remove a child from school without parental consent. When you put it that way, it sounds worse than it was. Miss Hendricks, how would you put it? Patricia's composure finally cracked. I was trying to help. That little girl deserved better than being left alone all the time while her father worked his important job. Someone needed to step in and make sure she was being properly cared for, and if Mr. Crawford wasn't going to be responsible, then yes, I thought I should do something about it. And you thought your position as HOA president gave you the authority to make that decision. I thought someone needed to make it. Rachel paused, letting Patricia's outburst hang in the air. Miss Hendricks, you've testified about your concerns for Emma's welfare. But isn't it true that your conflict with Mr. Crawford had nothing to do with his daughter's welfare, and everything to do with the fact that he challenged your authority as HOA president? That's not true. Really, let's review the timeline. You sent Mr. Crawford his first HOA violation notice within 2 weeks of him moving into the neighborhood, correct? If he was in violation, then yes, I would have sent him a notice. The violation was for his grass being too tall, even though it was within the height specified in the CC and Articus. Several neighbors have testified that his grass was no taller than anyone else's in the neighborhood. Isn't it true that you targeted him from the beginning? I enforce the rules equally for everyone. Do you? We've heard testimony from multiple residents that you issued violation notices to Mr. Crawford at a rate far exceeding what you issued to other residents. In the 18 months he lived in the neighborhood, you issued him 47 violation notices. The resident who received the second most notices during that same period received only 8. How do you explain that discrepancy? Patricia's face was flushed with anger now. He was the most frequent violator. Or was he the resident most likely to challenge your authority? Isn't it true that you became fixated on Mr. Crawford specifically because he refused to accept your interpretation of rules that didn't exist in the actual governing documents? He was defiant and disrespectful of community standards. And that made you angry. It made me concerned about the future of our neighborhood. Concerned enough to tell him, and I quote from his testimony, that you would regret defying my authority. I don't recall saying that exactly. But you don't deny having a confrontational interaction with him about a week before you attempted to take his daughter from school. We had a discussion about his basketball hoop violation. A violation based on a rule that doesn't exist in the CC and Articus. The rule is implied in the aesthetic standards section. Miss Hendricks, did you research Arizona kidnapping laws in the days before you went to Emma's school? Patricia's lawyer had clearly prepared her for this question, but she still looked uncomfortable. I may have looked up some legal information. I wanted to make sure I wasn't overstepping. And yet you proceeded anyway, despite learning that what you were planning was illegal. I didn't think it was illegal if I was acting out of genuine concern for a child's welfare. Did you consider that a district attorney might understand child welfare laws better than an HOA president? Fletcher objected, and Judge Morrison sustained it, but the point had been made. Rachel continued her cross-examination for another 30 minutes, methodically destroying every aspect of Patricia's defense. By the time she was done, Patricia was visibly angry and defensive, having dropped the sympathetic victim persona she'd started with. Closing arguments the next day were powerful on both sides. Fletcher did his best to create sympathy for Patricia, painting her as a flawed human being who'd made a terrible mistake, but who didn't deserve to have her life destroyed over it. He emphasized her lack of criminal history, her community service, and his expert's testimony about her impaired judgment due to stress. Rachel's closing was devastating. She walked the jury through every piece of evidence showing premeditation, deliberate planning, and conscious awareness that what Patricia was doing was illegal. She emphasized the potential danger Emma had been in, and the violation of trust that occurred when someone used fraudulent documents to try to remove a child from school. Ladies and gentlemen, the defense wants you to believe this was a mistake, a momentary lapse in judgment by a well-meaning community member. But the evidence tells a different story. This wasn't a spontaneous decision. The defendant planned this over several days. She researched the laws she would be breaking. She created fraudulent documents with a forged signature. She showed up at a school with a detailed false story. And when questioned, she became aggressive and demanding, insisting that her authority as HOA president meant she should be obeyed without question. This wasn't about concern for a child's welfare. This was about power and control, and it was about punishing a resident who dared to challenge that power. The defendant committed attempted kidnapping, a serious felony, and she did so deliberately and knowingly. The only appropriate verdict is guilty on all counts. The jury deliberated for 6 hours over 2 days. I tried to work during that time, but I couldn't focus. Emma was back in school and doing better, but I knew she was following this case closely despite my attempts to shield her from the details. She needed to know that justice would be served, that bad actions had consequences, that the system worked. When the call finally came that the jury had reached a verdict, I raced to the courthouse. The courtroom was packed again, with every seat filled and people standing in the back. Patricia sat at the defense table looking pale and drawn. When the jury filed in, none of them made eye contact with her, which I knew from experience was usually a bad sign for the defendant. Judge Morrison asked the jury foreman, a middle-aged software engineer, if they'd reached a verdict. "We have, Your Honor. On the count of attempted kidnapping, how do you find?" "We find the defendant guilty." Patricia let out a sound that was half sob, half gasp. Her attorney put a hand on her shoulder, but she shrugged it off. "On the count of forgery, how do you find?" "We find the defendant guilty." "On the count of fraud, how do you find?" "We find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted in noise, a mix of gasps, whispers, and a few scattered claps that Judge Morrison quickly silenced with her gavel. Patricia was now openly crying, her head in her hands. I felt no satisfaction, only a profound sense of relief that the system had worked and that Emma would know her father had fought for her and won. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, in late October. The presentence investigation report was thorough, documenting Patricia's history of escalating aggressive behavior, her lack of remorse beyond being caught, and the psychological impact on Emma. The prosecution recommended a substantial prison sentence, while the defense argued for probation with community service and mandatory counseling. I attended the sentencing hearing with my sister Lauren and Jim from next door. The courtroom was less packed than it had been during the trial, but still well attended. Several of my neighbors had submitted victim impact statements describing how Patricia's reign of terror had affected them, though I was the only one who would speak in person. When Judge Morrison called me to the stand to give my victim impact statement, I took a deep breath and tried to organize the swirl of emotions I'd been feeling for the past 5 months. "Your Honor, I've been a prosecutor for 12 years. I've seen the worst of what people can do to each other. But nothing prepared me for the fear I felt when I got that call from my daughter's school, telling me that someone had tried to take her. Emma is my entire world, especially since my wife died 3 years ago. The thought that someone could have succeeded in taking her, that she could have been driven away by a stranger with forged documents, that I might have lost her, it still makes me physically sick. Emma has nightmares now. She's in therapy. She watches the door at school anxiously whenever someone walks by. Her innocence and sense of safety have been shattered, and we're working every day to rebuild it." The defendant claims she was trying to help, that she was concerned about Emma's welfare, but that's a lie. This was about power and control. This was about punishing me for daring to challenge her authority, and she was willing to use my daughter as a pawn in that fight. That's unforgivable. I don't take joy in seeing anyone go to prison, but I believe strongly that there need to be serious consequences for what the defendant did, both to deter her from future behavior and to send a message that this kind of abuse of perceived authority will not be tolerated. Patricia's attorney presented several letters from friends and family members pleading for leniency, and then Patricia herself was given the opportunity to make a statement. She stood up, and for a moment I thought she might actually offer a genuine apology. But instead, she launched into a rambling speech about how she'd been vilified for trying to maintain community standards, how residents like me had made her job impossible, and how the real tragedy was that neighborhoods were declining because people wouldn't respect HOA authority. Judge Morrison's expression grew increasingly stern as Patricia spoke. When Patricia finally sat down, the judge took a moment to review her notes before speaking. "Miss Hendricks, I've reviewed all the materials presented, including the presentence investigation report, the victim impact statements, and the evidence presented at trial. I've also listened carefully to everything that's been said here today. I want to be clear about something. You were not convicted for being a strict HOA president. You were convicted for attempting to kidnap a child using forged documents. The jury found, and I agree, that you planned this action over several days, that you knew it was illegal, and that you proceeded anyway because you believed your position gave you the right to override a parent's authority over their own child. This represents a profound abuse of whatever limited power an HOA president has, and it put a child at risk. I've considered the defense's request for probation, but I find it inappropriate given the seriousness of the offenses and your apparent lack of genuine remorse. On the count of attempted kidnapping, I sentence you to 6 years in the Arizona Department of Corrections. On the counts of forgery and fraud, I sentence you to 2 years each, to run concurrently with the kidnapping sentence. You'll be eligible for parole after serving 4 years, provided you complete appropriate counseling programs while incarcerated. Additionally, upon release, you'll be prohibited from serving in any HOA leadership position for a period of 10 years, and you'll be subject to 5 years of supervised probation. I'm also issuing a permanent restraining order preventing you from having any contact with the Crawford family. Patricia looked like she'd been slapped. 6 years in prison was more than even the prosecution had requested. Her attorney immediately began talking about filing an appeal, but Patricia just sat there in shock as the bailiffs came to take her into custody. As I left the courthouse that day, I was approached by Carol Martinez, the new HOA president for Desert Springs Estates. She'd attended the entire sentencing hearing. "Michael, I want you to know that the board has completed our reforms. We've rewritten the enforcement procedures, implemented an appeals process, and we're requiring all board members to complete training on legal boundaries and appropriate behavior. We've also issued a formal apology to every resident who received bogus violation notices from Patricia, and we've refunded all the fines that were collected based on non-existent rules." I appreciate that, Carol, really. But I need you to understand that what happened went beyond just Patricia. The entire board enabled her behavior for years. You all knew she was out of control, but you didn't stop her until she tried to kidnap a child. That's on all of you. Carol's face fell, but she nodded. You're absolutely right. We should have acted sooner. We let fear of confrontation and misguided loyalty prevent us from doing what was right. I can't undo that, but I can promise you that we're committed to making sure nothing like this ever happens again in our neighborhood. I hope that's true. Because if I see any signs of the HOA returning to those tactics, I won't hesitate to take legal action. I understand, and Michael. For what it's worth, I'm truly sorry for what you and Emma went through. You deserved better from your neighbors." That evening, I sat down with Emma to explain what had happened at the sentencing. She was 8 now, a bit older and wiser than she'd been when this nightmare began. She listened carefully as I explained that the mean lady who tried to take her from school would be going to prison for a long time. "Is she going to learn to be nicer in prison?" Emma asked. "I hope so, sweetheart. Sometimes people need serious consequences before they can recognize that their behavior was wrong and make real changes." "Do you think she's sorry?" I thought about Patricia's statement in court, her continued insistence that she'd been in the right. I don't know if she's sorry yet, but maybe someday she will be. Emma was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm glad you're my dad. I know you'll always keep me safe." I pulled her into a hug, blinking back tears. "Always, Emma, I promise you that." Life gradually returned to normal over the following months. The media attention faded, though the case had sparked a broader national conversation about HOA oversight and accountability. 3 other states introduced legislation similar to what was being considered in Arizona, creating more checks and balances on HOA board authority. I received letters from people across the country thanking me for standing up to HOA tyranny and sharing their own horror stories. The Desert Springs Estates HOA, under Carol's leadership, became a model for reasonable community governance. They focused on actual maintenance issues and genuine community concerns, rather than petty aesthetic policing. The neighborhood became a more pleasant place to live, ironically achieving the goal of community harmony that Patricia had claimed to be pursuing, but had actually been undermining with her aggressive tactics. Emma's therapy continued, and gradually her nightmares became less frequent. She started to trust again, to feel safe. We kept the basketball hoop on our driveway, and she'd invite friends over to play. I taught her to shoot free throws, and we'd spend warm Arizona evenings practicing together, her laughter echoing through the neighborhood. About a year after the sentencing, I received a letter forwarded from the Arizona Department of Corrections. It was from Patricia. My first instinct was to throw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me. The letter was different from anything Patricia had said during the trial or sentencing. She apologized, genuinely it seemed, for what she'd done. She explained that she'd been participating in intensive therapy while incarcerated and had come to realize how distorted her thinking had become, how her need for control had escalated until she'd crossed lines she'd never imagined she would cross. She didn't ask for forgiveness or for me to respond, just wanted me to know that she finally understood the gravity of what she'd done and the harm she'd caused. I read the letter twice, then filed it away. I didn't respond because I didn't owe Patricia anything, but I was glad to know that maybe, just maybe, she was actually learning something from the consequences of her actions. One evening about 18 months after the incident, I was sitting on my front porch watching Emma ride her bike in the driveway when Jim walked over from next door with a cold beer for each of us. "How are you doing, Michael? Really doing?" he asked as we sat together in companionable silence. "We're good, Jim, really good. Emma's doing great in school, her therapy has been helpful, and I feel like we've finally moved past the trauma of what happened. It's been a long road, but we made it through. You know what the whole neighborhood says about you now. They say you're the guy who took down the HOA tyrant and made the neighborhood safe for having pink bicycles and basketball hoops." Jim grinned. "You're a legend," I laughed. "I'd rather not be a legend. I just wanted to keep my daughter safe and hold someone accountable for trying to harm her. The fact that it took down an abusive HOA president was just a bonus. Well, however you want to frame it, you did something important. You showed that even someone with perceived power and authority isn't above the law. That matters." As the sun set over the Phoenix desert, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. I watched Emma laugh as she practiced tricks on her bike. The basketball hoop stood proudly on our driveway. Our flowers bloomed in whatever colors we chose. And most importantly, my daughter was safe, happy, and knew that her father would always fight for her, no matter who or what stood in the way. The nightmare of that day when Patricia tried to take Emma from school would always be part of our story, but it didn't define us. What defined us was how we'd survived it together, how we'd used the system to hold someone accountable for their actions, and how we'd emerged stronger and more connected on the other side. That was the real victory, far more important than any legal judgment or prison sentence. We'd faced something terrifying and come through it intact, and that was all that really mattered in the end.